As of this taping, the conversation over education reform continues. The Black and Latino caucus has come to their own consensus on the best ways to effect reform, saying, among other things, that the definition of turnaround schools should not be exclusionary and supporting the idea of a commissioner's network to focus on the lowest performing schools. We spoke with caucus member Representative Jason Rojas, Rae Ann Knopf, Executive Director of the Connecticut Council for Education Reform, and Dr. Michael Sharpe, head of Jumoke Academy in Hartford, about the quest for some of the more controversial proposals. You know, a lot of people are kind of baking something or drawing conclusions about the timing of this press conference and the show of force. Should there be made anything of it?
Of course there is. I mean, at the end of the day, we're the legislature and we set policy. And in that discussion, in the context of this session anyway, it seems that the agenda has been driven largely by the governor and by the teachers' unions. And we felt it was appropriate for us to try to drive the agenda.
And yeah, I mean, because I know that education reform is actually an issue that the Black and Puerto Rican caucus has been working on not only this session, but for years, in fact. And tell me what's different about this session and what you hope are the main things that come out of it.
Well, it seems certainly the stakes were set a whole lot higher than in past years, and there was much more emphasis and I think media attention on it. So it's just become much more larger of an issue. And if we didn't accomplish some kind of real reform this year, I think we'd be letting ourselves down and the public down as well.
The key changes that you want to see?
We need to turn around chronically underperforming schools that have been underperforming for far too long.
And how you intend to do that? How would you like to?
Well, you know, at this point we've allowed local boards of education to try to do that, and I think we need to allow the State Department of Education to come in partnership with local districts to start to turn around those schools.
You know, one of the most controversial parts of the governor's proposal was the idea of this commissioner's network. Yep. Some people did not like the idea of what they saw essentially as a state takeover of local schools. Why you fall in line with that proposal and why you think it might be a good idea?
Because we don't see it as a state takeover. What we do is see it as state intervention in what are underperforming schools, and certainly there's precedent for that, as we've seen in Hartford in the past and most recently in Bridgeport and Wyndham.
And it's perhaps an issue that affects your constituents in a great way.
Sure, yeah, probably more so East Hartford than Manchester. But at the end of the day, we're talking about chronically underperforming schools, and we can no longer accept that.
Charter schools are also a hot topic and a highly contested topic as part of this education reform package. You all are pushing to make sure that those are included in the definition of schools and the focus of schools. Why is that?
You know, what we want to do is offer all the potential solutions that are out there, and we don't want to close anything off. As Representative Holder Winfield mentioned, not all of us were comfortable with every concept in there, but at the end of the day, we wanted to act as a caucus and you know, act like a caucus, and therefore charter schools were included in the discussion.
How would you characterize the debate and some of the conversation about education reform this session, not only here in the Capitol, but at the governor's town hall meeting?
You know, I think we've largely been distracted by a lot of things that don't really actually have anything to do with student performance, and I think what we need to do is focus on instruction and actual policy that affects student achievement.
At the end of the day, at the end of the session, you think we're going to have a good package?
I believe so, yeah.
If you would just give your reaction to kind of the message that was sent here today.
Well, I think we all need to applaud the Black and Puerto Rican caucus for stepping out on these issues. I mean, they took on sensitive issues like elect to work, impact bargaining, charter models in schools that really need innovation, and we need to applaud them for that.
You know, and they also, as you said, they're taking on some of the more controversial parts of it, charter schools, the commissioner's network, which has really brought out a lot of emotion from people in town hall meetings, and I guess talk about why what you get the sense from them in terms of how it affects their constituents and why they felt it was so necessary to have a voice in this.
Well, I think the sense I get from them is they are acknowledging their responsibilities as leaders of people in their communities and feel that they need to step out boldly and strongly and act on this issue and not wait for others to act.
How would you characterize the conversation that's been had not only here in the Capitol but in those town hall meetings?
Well, I think it's been really contentious. I think there's been a lot of mudslinging and things said that if people step back and looked at it, I don't think people would really want to see themselves characterized in the way that they have been. But people have stooped to some pretty low statements, which I think are unfortunate, and I think it detracts from the focus on children.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because I think people are afraid. They don't know what the changes will look like. I think that they are feeling the need to change the way they do things, and they don't know what it looks like for them in the future. And so, as adults, I think it's difficult for them to think about making those changes.
Are there key parts of the proposal as it was originally presented that you do not want this session to end without going into place?
Well, we certainly don't want it to end without we certainly want something to go through, definitely. And we feel strongly that the Commissioners Network, the elements that they talked about today, have to be in place in order to make a difference in the districts with those 40% of our children. We also feel strongly that if you put an evaluation system in place that determines effectiveness, then we need a process whereby we determine what happens with teachers who are ineffective, meaning we have to get to the tenure issue. We can't avoid it.
For people who see the Commissioners Network as, or they term it as essentially a state takeover, why are they wrong in that kind of characterization?
Well, I think they're missing the point that the State Department, the State Board of Education, the State Department of Education, the Commissioner of Education all exist to ensure that our public education system is healthy and functioning. And when it's not, they have a responsibility to act. So to insist that they're not allowed to act eliminates them from being able to do the very things they're put in place to do in the first place.
And I don't know, any final message you want to give at this juncture in the debate?
I would just ask that people continue to make courageous decisions like those that were made today, and to step out and not be afraid to do that on behalf of Connecticut's children.
First, I'll just give your reaction to this press conference and this show of force, really, by the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus.
I am just really proud of the Black and Hispanic Caucus for taking a leadership position and being very clear to our community. This is where they stand, and I think their stand, if it's implemented, will advance closing the achievement gap, in particular for kids living in the urban centers.
They talked a lot about their main message today, to me, was a lot about the turnaround schools, the inclusion, opening up the definition of which schools would be included. And tell me why that's important to you.
That's important because when you talk about turnaround schools, you're talking about schools that are in the urban centers. They're in the cities of Connecticut. And that's where our children are. And so we really have to get that right. And so when you start excluding models that have proven successful in turning around our kids to higher achievement, then there's something wrong with a bill that would do that. And so they're standing up, the caucus standing up today and saying that's not something that's acceptable. That's an important message for our community.
You know, the criticism of charter schools is nothing new. Tell me, do you think that people are becoming more accepting of it as a model that works for certain children?
Well, I think you have to. When you have a charter school like Jumoke Academy sitting in Hartford, where 100% of its third graders are achieving at or above grade, and 94% of its eighth graders, you have to recognize that. And then when people say, well, they're creaming the crop or something, they have to understand for 5 years, Jumoke Academy was the lowest performing school in the city of Hartford. And we still have the same population, the same families. So we didn't start off with high-performing students. We suffered for 5 to 6 years before we got it right.
I recently had a guest on who was talking about the financing component. He thought that charter schools get too much money. There's also a private fundraising part that he thinks should account for less funding from the state. Your thought?
Well, charter schools receive $9,400 a year. The average in the state is $12,600, and if you go in some of the towns like Hartford, it's probably closer to $14,000. In terms of private monies, Jumoke Academy opened in 1997, and the first time we received private money was 2 years ago for $125,000. That's not a lot of money. There are some charter schools that raise a significant amount of monies. The majority of charter schools do not, and they operate on the funds that are provided by the state. And so, first of all, it's really a false assumption if we're educating public school children that you want us to run out and get private monies to run those schools, and then you complain that you don't want schools to be privatized. That doesn't make any sense. So you need to fund public schools fairly and equally so that our kids can get a good education.
We've also heard a lot of people hesitant, worried about this idea of a commissioner's network. Why do you think that scares people?
I'm not sure why it scares people, but it gives me a little bit of comfort that schools that have been not performing for our children for over 20, 25, 30 years, someone has the authority to say enough is enough, stop this, and we're going to turn these schools around. And so if you're afraid of turning around a school and make it successful, then I guess you're afraid of the Commissioner's Network. Otherwise, any tool that makes our kids improve in these urban centers in particular is a good tool.
How confident are you feeling at this point that you might get some or any of what you're looking for?
I am greatly encouraged because the Black and Hispanic Caucus stood up and said this is what should happen. I think that's going to go a long ways to getting at least a balanced bill coming out of the General Assembly.
Don't forget, if you missed something here on The Real Story, you can now watch it online by going to ctnow.com. You can also catch us on YouTube. Thanks for watching this week's edition of The Real Story. We'll see you here again next week.